going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the JT Sports Podcast. I'm your host, JT. I know it's been a while, y'all boys, but had to hop back on here before the wild card round of the NFL playoffs kicks off to give my thoughts on all of the action that transpired during the semifinals of the college football playoffs. We are one step closer to the finish line, which is having a national champion being crowned. Who would have thought that we would be getting Notre Dame versus Ohio State for all the marbles? I'm pretty sure a good amount of y'all probably had Ohio State making it to this point, but let's not act like anybody thought that Notre Dame was going to be as good as what they've been. The fact that they were able to beat a really good Penn State team, and the round before that, they take down Georgia. You know, Notre Dame isn't a Cinderella team, in my opinion, but you might as well consider them a Cinderella. They're like a 9.5 point, 10-point underdog going into this matchup against Ohio State. But with how Michigan beat Ohio State in their regular season finale, I believe that that game gave Notre Dame the blueprint to pulling off this upset over Ohio State. So we're going to dive into how Notre Dame can find a way to beat Ohio State for the national title. But before we dive into that, I got to give you guys my thoughts on the semifinal games. You know, Texas lost to Ohio State 28-14. Steve Sarkisian, his fatal flaw, pretty much helped send Ohio State to the Natty. And the SEC, it's funny for all of the hypotheticals that gets thrown out there on social media because, you know, the SEC, they're undefeated when it comes to hypotheticals. They went out really sad in the college football playoffs. And Ohio State, you know, ever since they lost to Michigan, they just have become unstoppable. And Notre Dame took down Penn State in the all-time classic. That win for Notre Dame, not only has it shown how elite of a coach Marcus Freeman is, but it also showed that Brian Kelly is the most overrated head coach in college football. And then on the Penn State side of things, we're going to touch on them because I think that their running this year's CFP was an absolute fluke. Drew Aller, he completely tanked this draft stock. There was some rumblings coming out that if he played well, he could end up declaring for the draft, although he said that he would stay for another season. And some things unrelated to the playoffs. Miami got Carson Beck out of the portal. As a Miami fan, you guys know I have to give my thoughts on that. So shout out to everybody that's tuned in wherever you're at. YouTube, X, Facebook. Make sure that you smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit that post notification so you don't miss when we go live and drop new content. Shout out to my guy Rob's Pippin Road. He says, what's your Super Bowl pick, JT? And Happy New Year's to you. Happy New Year's to you as well, my dude. I'm rolling with the Chiefs to win it all. I'm hoping that the Ravens win, and I want to see my dude Lamar Jackson hoist that Lombardi trophy, but sadly, I think the Chiefs are going to be able to get it done, and they're going to end up three-peating. Now, let's dive into all of these playoff matchups. So, Texas fell 28-14 to Ohio State, and Steve Sarkisian, his fatal flaw, pretty much sent Ohio State on a one-way ticket to the national championship. You know, a second and goal, you're trying to tie the game up, and you're at the 1 yard line. And any of us with some common sense probably would have went with a fullback dive, the tush push, because you know the tush push is the most unstoppable play in football. Anytime you call the tush push, to me, I don't know what the science says behind it, but in my calculations, has a 95.67% chance of working out, especially when you're that close in range of being able to score. But instead of going with the tush push, Steve Sarkisian, I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he thought that they had an advantage on the edge over Ohio State that he thought Texas could have exploited. But he goes for a halfback toss. and it gets blown up. You lose 7 yards. You get put in 3rd and long, 4th and long, and of course they don't convert because you know Quinn Ewers, this dude has no pocket awareness at all. And ultimately, Texas lost this game because of Steve Sarkisian failing to have good play calling in the red zone. The red zone has been a big Achilles heel for Steve Sarkisian, not just as the head coach of the Longhorns, but when he was an offensive coordinator for 1 year in the NFL for the Atlanta Falcons, back in his days when he was the head coach at USC. For some reason, in spite of how good of a play caller Steve Sarkisian is, he just outsmarts himself or outthinks it once he gets inside of the 20-yard line. And I didn't even know coming into this game that Texas was this bad in the red zone. They're 111th in the FBS when it comes to red zone scoring. And there were so many different ways Texas could have punched the ball in. Rather you put in Arch Manning and you run a quarterback power. But to me, not only was that a sign of Steve Sarkisian's fatal flaw coming back to haunt Texas, but it also is a sign that, Texas at their core still is a finesse football team. Steve Sarkisian didn't have enough faith that his big boys up front could generate enough push against Ohio State's defensive line. And when you're trying to score from this close in, you're not going to do it by trying to be finesse. You have to have a sort of power. You got to have a sort of strength up front. And you got to have a different kind of mentality that you're going to say, hey, we're not about to try to outthink this thing. We're not about to try to beat them on the edge. We're about to run this football down their throat, up the middle. I don't care if it takes 1, 2, or 3 attempts. We're going to find a way to pound this rock in and tie this game up from the 1-yard line. I just can't believe that decision by Steve Sarkisian to call that play. I know some people don't like to question play calling, but sometimes you have a right to question play calling when you have a situation like this where it's just so blatantly apparent that you have a guy in Steve Sarkisian that just didn't trust his personnel. That's what it looked like to me. And remember, in the semifinals last season, when Texas lost to Washington, when they came back in the game, they lost that same game as well in similar fashion because Steve Sarkisian, his red zone play calling was awful. For some reason, when Texas gets inside of the 20, Steve Sarkisian, he either tries to beat you on the outside with slot fades, or he tries to throw some 50-50 balls in the red zone, or he wants to beat you on the perimeter. That's not winning football when you get to this area of the field. You have to be able to showcase your dominance up front. I thought Texas had one of the best offensive lines in college football this season. So why was that not demonstrated in this situation on 2nd and goal, 1 yard out? Yeah, Ohio State has a good defensive line, but you have just as many good players on the offensive line as what Ohio State has on the D-line. This was one of the worst play calls that we have ever witnessed in the history of college football, because I've never seen a coach squander such a big opportunity to win a game as what we saw in this matchup. Because Steve Sarkisian, you just expect way more out of this brother when you think about how much praise he gets around the landscape of college football for how brilliant of an offensive mind that he is. So the red zone play calling, I don't care how bad Quinn Ewers played. He played better in the second half than what he did in the first half. I put 125% of this loss on Steve Sarkisian, just trying to outthink the room instead of trying to run it up the middle or going with the tush push, which normally always works. He wants to win on the edge, and of course it backfired. When you have a defense as good as Ohio State, I don't even understand what he was thinking with all of the speed and the aggressiveness that Ohio State likes to play with. Once you get into that area and you come out in shotgun and you're that close out, it's pretty apparent what you're about to do, because not a lot of teams are about to run an inside run out of the shotgun when you're 1 yard out. You're either going to pitch it or you're going to run some kind of design quarterback run. So that just was a terrible play call. Sometimes for some of these coaches, the moment can get too big and they think that they have to do a little bit more than what's actually required. And that's how they end up beating themselves and costing their team. After the game, number 16, who plays defense for Texas, he was breaking down the locker room, and I felt really bad for him. I would be frustrated too because Steve Sarkisian cheated his team out of an opportunity to make it to the national championship. This game was a lot closer than what was initially expected. And the final score doesn't indicate how close this game actually was, but that one play alone just completely changed everything with this game. It just was an awful play call. There's no way you can defend it. Yeah, I know that you know it's a little bit below my pay grade to be trying to criticize somebody's play calling, but that definitely was a moment where if Steve Sarkisian could have ran it back, he would have did things a little bit differently. He tried to justify it in the post-game press conference saying how, you know, at the end of the day, the players got to execute. Man, that's just BS to me. Because the players got to execute, but as the head coach, it's your responsibility to put your players in the right position to succeed, to win the game. And Steve Sarkisian did a poor job of that. And that's why Texas is now going back home. And that's why Ohio State is playing one last game with an opportunity to win it all. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in, wherever you're watching, YouTube, X, Facebook. Give us a like, subscribe, follow if you're new. Shout out to my guy, John and Rachel A. They say based on last night, Notre Dame can win, but if Ohio plays like they do best, it will be tough. Absolutely, I definitely agree with that. You know, for the SEC to be undefeated when it comes to hypotheticals, I was expecting a way better outing out of this conference than what we saw during the playoffs. This is the second straight year that we're going to have a national championship without a team from the SEC in it. And during this playoffs, you had Tennessee, Georgia, Texas. They all lost by more or at least 2 possessions. They lost on an average margin of 17 points. Now, that's a little bit inflated because of how bad of a loss Tennessee took to Ohio State in the first round, but the SEC just didn't bring their A game this year in the expanded 12-team college football playoffs. And initially, when the playoffs first initially expanded from 4 to 12 teams, there was a lot of conversation about how the SEC was guaranteed to win it all every single year with more teams being able to get in, and all that's happened is the complete polar opposite of what was expected. Because the SEC, not only did you get less teams in than what you initially expected, but, you know, you can make the argument that Tennessee didn't belong in the playoffs this year. They didn't look like one of the best 12 teams in college football, in my opinion. Their best win, to me, was against Alabama. Nico Iamaleava, with him being so young and that offense being heavily dependent on Dylan Sampson, they didn't really look like a team that had a chance to win it all. And their defense, for as good as how they played for the majority of the regular season, Ohio State was driving up and down the field against them like they were practicing against air. The way that Tennessee-Ohio State game went, you would have thought it was an exhibition matchup. I thought we was watching the spring game with how easy Ohio State was making it look against Tennessee. And then, who would have thought that Georgia would have lost to Notre Dame? I'm not trying to undersell Notre Dame, but 3 years ago, nobody would have ever expected for Notre Dame to beat Georgia and to beat them by 2 possessions at that. Notre Dame, the way they handled Georgia, you never really questioned who the better team was. From start to finish, Notre Dame just was downright way better than what Georgia was. And Georgia has a way more talented roster compared to what Notre Dame has. And then Texas, they got fortunate enough that they beat Clemson, they beat Arizona State. You expect a SEC opponent to be able to take care of a Big 12 foe or any other team outside of the Big 10. But the way they lost against Texas, although they did show a lot of heart in that game, at the end, the final score shows 28-14. You expect that game to at least come down to a touchdown or less. Because Texas poured as much money into this year's team as what Ohio State did into theirs. So there is no reasoning for Texas to lose in the fashion that they did. And you know, for the SEC to have been as dominant as what it's been for over the last 2 decades, it's safe to say that this year's playoffs showed us that their reign of dominance over college football has officially came to an end. Now, I'm not saying that the SEC is not going to be able to bounce back next year, but what this shows is that there is a pendulum now that has swung in college football. It looks like the Big Ten has now started to cement themselves as the top dog in college football now. Now, that could be due to a bunch of reasons, but the main one is that the SEC isn't the only team that has money to throw around. Ohio State put $20 million into this 2024 team. You got Michigan, who has Dave Portnoy now, the owner of Barstool, who's pouring money into that program. You got a lot of teams in the middle portion of the country that have a lot of NIL money. And you look at Alabama, you look at Brian Kelly, who is begging his fans to donate to LSU's NIL fund. I think that the SEC is now starting to get scared because they now are quickly starting to realize that the Big Ten has caught up to them. They, for so long, it's been this perception that they've been the only conference that's had enough money to be able to consistently put together an elite team year in and year out. Even if they were to lose a few players in the portal, they could overcome those losses. But outside of Texas and Oklahoma and maybe a few other schools in the SEC, like Florida has a pretty strong NIL backing, which kind of surprised me because Florida kind of is in the middle of nowhere. If you ever been to Gainesville, Florida, you would know that it's a very country area. You know, for Florida to have such a big NIL backing, it just shocks me when you think about where that school is located. But the rest of the country has money to spend in NIL as well. Texas Tech has been throwing a lot of money into their NIL fund. They have like a top 3, top 5 portal class that they're bringing into this season. So the SEC, within the next 2 or 3 years from now, not only is the Big Ten going to catch up to this conference, but the Big 12 is, and so is the ACC, because the SEC now, their big advantage for so many decades has been that we have the best athletes, we have the best coaches, where you no longer can say that anymore because the Big Ten has really good coaches. You got Jedd Fisch. I still believe in Lincoln Riley. You got Dan Lanning. Eventually, he's going to break through. We don't really know about Sharon Moore yet, but Ryan Day, it looks like he's very well on his way to cementing himself as one of the elites in college football, claiming his first national championship if he's able to take down the Fighting Irish. So, I mean, the SEC, you got a really bad wake-up call in the playoffs this year. You went out really sad. Every time you log into social media, you see these SEC hypotheticals. Well, if Alabama got in, they would have been favored over Notre Dame. They would have been favored over Indiana. They would have been favored over SMU. That's why you play the games. Expanding the playoffs, initially when the idea first came to fruition, I thought it was terrible. I thought that it was going to devalue the importance of the regular season. And I thought that all it was going to do was further make it easier for the SEC to continue to keep their monopoly over college football. But this thing did not go the way that I expected it to. And in the foreseeable future, if we expand to more teams, I think the SEC is quickly going to find out that they no longer are what they thought they were. And what's even more surprising is that, believe it or not, the Big Ten and the SEC, they got the highest revenue share out of all the teams in the college football playoffs outside of Notre Dame because they're not in the conference and they don't have to worry about splitting revenue with anybody else. I think eventually, if the SEC continues to underperform in the postseason, some of these other conferences like the ACC and the Big 12, they're going to have a little bit of some say in the revenue splits, and they're going to have to say, hey, like, y'all ain't the top dogs no more. You feel me? Our conference is just as good as your conference, so how about we split a little bit more of the pie, a little bit more equally? And, you know, there was some rumblings about how if the SEC didn't get their way, depending on how the committee judged their conference, they was going to take their belongings, disassociate themselves from the rest of the NCAA, partner up with the Big Ten, and create somewhat of the equivalent to what the AFC and the NFC conferences are in the NFL. And we will have like 2 mega conferences. Well, I don't see that happening anymore. To me, it looks like we finally have gotten what we've been asking for so long, which is parity. Yeah, we still have Ohio State in the national championship, but we got Notre Dame in the national championship. And I think a few years from now, we will see a team that kind of comes out of nowhere and starts competing for national championships. Maybe it's Colorado. Maybe it's Arizona State. Hell, maybe it ends up being Clemson right back in the forefront, because Clemson, they've been spending a lot of money in the portal relative to what they've done in years past. They're firing coaches now. It looks like Dabo Swinney sees an opportunity to get back into the national title conversation with how vulnerable the SEC looks right now. So for all of you SEC fans out there that like to float around these hypotheticals, how are you feeling now? Undefeated in hypotheticals, but you're losing in the playoffs. Embarrassing. You went out really sad this year. And not just in the playoffs, but in the non-playoff matchups. In bowl season, Alabama got handled by Michigan. Texas A&M choked against USC. I mean, the SEC, we got a lot more questions than we have answers about the future of this conference moving forward into the 2025 season. Now, as strange as it is for Ohio State to have played, let me rephrase that. It's really weird how Ohio State, ever since they took that loss to Michigan during the final week of the regular season, all of a sudden, they've looked unstoppable. I mean, they've been murdering everybody. You slaughtered Tennessee, you slaughtered Oregon in your first 2 playoff games, and then you still beat Texas despite being in a close game for the majority of that ball game. You win by 2 touchdowns with the way that game unfolded in the last couple of minutes. And now with Ohio State, you got to ask yourself, how has Ohio State all of a sudden been able to play better football since taking that loss to their biggest rival? Well, I feel like losing to Michigan was the best thing that ever happened to Ohio State, because it made them reevaluate themselves. When they played Ohio State, they tried to beat them with a way that their team isn't built to win, which is they wanted to try to bully Michigan. They were coming into that game with the mindset of, we invested $20 million into this team. We got the more superior roster. We got a better coaching staff. We can play bully ball with you. We can run it down your throat just like you can run it down our throat. Well, Ohio State, they beat themselves against Michigan. And after that loss, they got humbled. They went back to the drawing board and they got back to what was working, which is them being able to kill you on the perimeter, using the passing attack to open up the run game. And ever since then, you got Quinshon Judkins, who has finally awoken from his slumber. During the playoffs, Quinshon Judkins has played his best football at the right moment. Because initially, when you looked at how he was playing during the regular season, without a doubt, Travion Henderson was not only the best running back on the roster, but Quinshon Judkins, it looked like Ohio State kind of wasted money buying him out of the portal from Ole Miss. And then, not only has Quinshon Judkins and your rushing attack been rolling, but the entire offense has looked even more efficient now than what it did prior to sustaining that loss to Michigan. I mean, it seems like Ohio State, every time on their opening possession, when they get the football, they always put a touchdown on the board. They just start out the game lightning hot. Ryan Day, Chip Kelly, they've been coaching their tails off, and the defense has played with a different level of intensity, a different level of violence that we didn't see that side of the ball play with for the majority of this season. I think it's safe to say that losing to Michigan flipped the switch for Ohio State, because it made this team unstoppable. It made this team realize that, we got to get back to who we are. We need to get back to what our strengths are. And sometimes in life, you got to take a few setbacks to look at yourself in the mirror, reflect on what caused you to have to take a few steps backwards so you can make those corrections. Sometimes taking a loss can somewhat be a W in disguise, because sometimes we need to get a little bit humbled for us to realize who we truly are. Because sometimes when we're trying to be something that we're not, that's what causes us to lose. That's what causes us to suffer setbacks. And for Ohio State, with the way that they played against Oregon, yeah, I know that they just beat Texas, but I still can't believe the way that they just manhandled Oregon. Nobody expected that game to go the way that it did. Oregon and Ohio State were two of the favorites to win it all this season. And with Oregon beating them their first go around, barely by only 1 point, you know, you would have thought that that game was going to result in being an instant classic, and it was complete wash. By the time we got to halftime, the game was already over. You know, Ohio State just looks like a completely different animal thanks to taking that loss to Michigan. And even if they do beat Notre Dame, I still feel like this season isn't going to feel complete because they lost to Michigan. Yeah, your goal is to win it all, but you got to understand how big of a game that Michigan-Ohio State matchup is. That's why they call it the game, because that game single-handedly changed both programs for the better. Ohio State, since losing that game, Ryan Day and that coaching staff, they've been putting together some awesome game plans. That team has looked like one of the best teams that we've seen in the playoffs over the last couple of years since 2019 LSU. And then for Michigan, you know, that win for them gave them reaffirmed faith that Sharon Moore has what it takes to lead this program back to the level that it was before Jim Harbaugh departed for the NFL. But Ohio State, I just can't believe how they just look like this completely different team since losing to Michigan. And it's a testament to how good of a coaching staff Ryan Day has assembled. And it's a testament to how good of a coach Ryan Day is. Having a championship, to me, doesn't always define how good of a head coach you are. Sometimes it takes a while to get over that hump. The same conversation that we're having about Ryan Day was the same conversation that at one point a few years ago we were having about Kirby Smart. Remember when he was struggling to beat Alabama and he kept on coming up short against Nick Saban? Well, when he was finally able to kick the doors down and he got that first national title win, you saw Georgia end up winning back-to-back. You know, sometimes it takes you to get your first taste of championship gold to help elevate you to a different level. And if Ohio State wins it all this year, we very well could see them win it all again next year. Maybe they could go back-to-back. Maybe they could three-peat and do what Georgia was unable to do. Because they got a really good NIL structure. You got a great coaching staff. So, I mean, for Ohio State losing to Michigan, yeah, it still sucks that they have bragging rights over you. You lost to the team up north. But if you don't lose that game, who knows if you go as far in the playoffs as what you have at this point. The biggest loser of the Notre Dame versus Penn State semifinal matchup is not James Franklin, it's not Drew Aller, it's actually LSU head coach Brian Kelly. Because when Brian Kelly left Notre Dame for the LSU job, his reasoning for that was because he felt like LSU gave him more resources that he wasn't getting at Notre Dame to better his chances of being able to win a national championship. And all he's done at LSU is underachieve. This guy had a Heisman Trophy winner, Jaden Daniels, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr., who were all first rounders in the NFL in last year's draft. He had a lead offensive line, and he couldn't even win the SEC championship. And with the playoffs now including 12 teams, you would have thought that LSU, with all of the talent that they bring in on a year-to-year basis, how well Brian Kelly recruits, they would have been a lock to be in the playoffs every single year. But instead, they underachieve. And yet Marcus Freeman has elevated Notre Dame to a level that they were unable to get to with Brian Kelly as the head coach. I got an alarming stat for you LSU fans. During Brian Kelly's 3 years in Baton Rouge, he is 4-9 against ranked opponents. And not all of those losses came against SEC teams. This past year, you lost to USC. And then in the years prior, You went 0-2 against Mike Norvell and Florida State when you played them in the season opener. Meanwhile, Marcus Freeman, with his recent playoff win against Penn State, he's now 14-5 against ranked teams during his tenure replacing Brian Kelly at Notre Dame. That now ties him for the most ranked wins with Kirby Smart at Georgia over that span. Marcus Freeman was an upgrade, and Brian Kelly going to LSU was a downgrade for them in some capacity because they haven't reached the same level of success that you thought they would have been when they initially made that decision to get Brian Kelly to leave South Bend for Baton Rouge. And the differences between Marcus Freeman and Brian Kelly is that, for one, Marcus Freeman is more likable. The players relate to him better than what they did with Brian Kelly. When Brian Kelly gave his exit speech to the players, the guys didn't really seem like they cared. And then a few seconds later, when Brian Kelly walks out the room and Marcus Freeman comes in, all the players are cheering, they're hooraying, they're hugging them, they're celebrating. And I find it weird how none of the players that Brian Kelly recruited at Notre Dame followed them to play for him at LSU. I think that shows a lot. Brian Kelly is a good coach, but not a great coach, because I think that the one area that Marcus Freeman thrives in that Brian Kelly kind of lacks is the fact that he's able to develop a better relationship with his players, and he doesn't need to have a stacked team to do so. Marcus Freeman says that we're not going to major in the transfer portal. We're going to minor in the portal. We're only going to get a select few of players out of the portal. Meanwhile, you got Brian Kelly who keeps saying that I need more talent. I need more of this. I need more of that. You already took the LSU job because they had everything you need to win, and yet you still don't have enough. Brian Kelly has gone all out in the portal this year. They have one of the best portal classes, but I still don't think that's going to translate to success on the field because Brian Kelly is not that good of a coach. You know, having a talented team doesn't guarantee that you're going to win. We've seen plenty of coaches over the last couple of years, like Mike Elko at Duke and Kalen DeBoer at Washington, do more with less. Kalen DeBoer took Washington to the national championship, along the way taking down Dan Lanning twice and Steve Sarkisian with a roster that was vastly inferior to what those schools had. You know, they had the 31st rated roster according to the 247 Sports Team Talent Composite rankings. That year, he took Washington to the national championship, and they lost to Michigan. You look at what Mike Elko did at Duke. Duke, before he got there, was more of a basketball school. Football was an afterthought. And when I look at Brian Kelly and I see him making excuses for why he doesn't have enough, it makes me feel like this dude just is never going to have enough just because he's not enough as a head coach. With Marcus Freeman, though, he has no problem winning with the guys that he has right now. And I know that Brian Kelly already took Notre Dame to a national championship in the past. But the difference is Notre Dame, back during the BCS era when they made it, they didn't have such a gauntlet to get to that game as what Marcus Freeman had to go through to get to that national championship this year against Ohio State. He had to beat Indiana, who's a top 10 team, Georgia, who's a top 10 team, Penn State, who's a top 10 team. He had to beat 3 straight top 10 teams 3 consecutive weeks in order to get to this game. Brian Kelly didn't have that amount of rigor to get to Notre Dame's national championship, the long one that they made under him. And when they went into that game, I was listening to an interview with Manti Te'o that's on YouTube. He said that before the game even started, they knew that they were outmatched. Just when you look at the size that Alabama had when they were coming out of the tunnel onto the field for that game compared to what Notre Dame had. You see, when you have a great coach, he can make up for certain limitations. Brian Kelly can't make up for certain limitations just because he's going to use those limitations as an excuse for why he can't win. All Brian Kelly has done is constantly make excuses for why he can't get it done. You know, it's funny how I heard somebody try to say if Notre Dame had an SEC schedule, they wouldn't be in the playoffs. But Marcus Freeman this season is 2-0 against the two teams that Brian Kelly felt to beat this year, that being USC and the other one being Texas A&M. And remember, Notre Dame beat Texas A&M in College Station week 1 of the regular season. LSU went to College Station and they completely imploded on themselves in the second half of that game. You know, Marcus Freeman beat that Lincoln Riley team, but yet Brian Kelly couldn't. You know, I'm starting to see an overlying theme when it comes to discussing Brian Kelly. He's somebody that needs more and continues to do less with it. Meanwhile, Marcus Freeman is doing more with what Brian Kelly said wasn't enough for him. You know, Brian Kelly is a good coach, but he's not a great coach. You see, when he was at Notre Dame, he was a big fish in a small pond. But in the SEC, where you're going up against coaches that are just as good as you on a week-to-week basis and teams that have the same amount of talent that's what you have, you go from being a big fish in a small pond to being a little fish in the ocean with a lot of sharks. And right now, Brian Kelly's swimming with the sharks. And Marcus Freeman is quickly starting to rise up the ranks. And he's starting to cement himself as one of the best coaches in college football. When you see the way that Notre Dame beat Penn State with the backup offensive tackle, their backup quarterback having to come in before halftime, he was able to drive them down the field, get some points. You know, it's a testament to how good of a coach Marcus Freeman is, because he just finds a way to elevate the players that he has. And meanwhile, you got Brian Kelly who's screaming at his receivers. You know, like Brian Kelly just doesn't look authentic. When I look at the recruiting videos that Brian Kelly has with recruits and he's dancing, it just looks cringy. You know, when he first got to LSU, remember he tried to fake a Southern accent? You know, this dude just isn't authentic. That's why he doesn't resonate with players the same way that Marcus Freeman does. And if you want to be able to win, it's not all about having a great team. It's all about getting that team to play together as a family. That's what Nick Saban did such a great job at Alabama. It wasn't just because he had all the talent, he could buy up everybody. Jimbo Fisher had great teams at Texas A&M, and he never won. You know, you got to bring these players together, and you have to create a bond. It has to be one team, one goal. When you see Notre Dame play, they play as a family. They play as one. When you see LSU play, you can't say the same thing. Notre Dame advancing to the national championship with how dominant their playoff run has looked, because they did beat Georgia by 2 possessions. And yeah, they had a close win against Penn State. They handled Indiana. You know, it just is a testament to how LSU kind of did Notre Dame a favor. Because now Notre Dame upgraded that head coach with the guy that understands what it takes to win at Notre Dame. Brian Kelly didn't really quite understand how to maximize everything that he had in South Bend. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in wherever you're watching, YouTube, X, Facebook. Make sure that you smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon if you're new so you don't miss when we drop new content and when we go live. If you're listening on podcasting platforms, make sure that you go ahead, give us a 5-star review, share this episode. If you enjoy, the links to the podcast, if you're on YouTube, are down in the description down below. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts from. Apple, Spotify, Amazon, the JT Sports Podcast is available. Shout out to Valerie1111. She drops 100 emojis. Shout out to M Sparks. He says dinner special in Pittsburgh, fried raven. I don't know about that. I don't know about that, man. I got Baltimore minus 9.5 on my parlay, and I expect that to hit. A lot of people are expecting it to hit. The last time a team won a playoff game that entered the postseason on a 4-game win streak, it was like in 1995, 1994, when you're a cold team going into the playoffs more times than not, you end up being one and done. And I think the Steelers and the Texans are going to be the two obvious teams that we're not going to see advancing to the next round. But I'm rooting for my Steelers to win, but from a money standpoint, from a financial standpoint, I got the Ravens winning that one, man. Even without Zay Flowers, they just got way too much for Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh doesn't have an offense. I just can't see the Steelers winning that one. Now, Penn State lost to Notre Dame in the semifinals 27-24, and that game showed me that their entire playoff run was a complete fluke, because out of all of the teams that made it to the semifinals, Penn State had the easiest path to that game. You know, they only had to play SMU and Boise State, two of the weaker teams that were in the playoffs this year, and they were double-digit favorites in both of those games, and they were always overrated to me, because I was looking at Penn State and I was asking, you know, who have they beaten? They lost to Ohio State. They lost to Oregon in the Big Ten championship game. The only two good teams they played all season. Drew Aller didn't look that good in either of those games, and he didn't look good against USC. You have to come back from behind and win that game in overtime. You know, Penn State, I felt like them losing to Notre Dame was destined to happen. You know, it was a little bit of a shocker to some, the way the outcome of that game transpired, but it really wasn't to me, because Notre Dame, they're a battle-tested team. They are a team that not only are they well coached, but they have an outstanding defense. And this game was the perfect example of why you can't judge a team based off history. You see, the premise with Notre Dame this year in the playoffs, why they were counted out, is that, well, they always come up short. Well, you can't judge Notre Dame from what they've done in years prior when they were in the playoffs, because this is a way different team than what they were those years. You see, with Penn State, their lack of elite playmakers on the perimeter hurt them in this game. Did you know that none of Penn State's receivers caught a single pass in that game? That shocked me. When you think of how well James Franklin recruits, you wouldn't think that his receivers would be so bad that they would get strapped up by Notre Dame. But Notre Dame, turns out, they have one of the best secondaries in college football. You see, when you're going up against SMU and Boise State, it's easy to have your stock inflated. Okay, because SMU and Boise State, from a roster standpoint, they don't come nowhere close to Penn State. But Notre Dame did. You see, Notre Dame in the second half, they won by staying true to who they are. They just find ways to win because they're good in all three phases of the game. Decent on offense with a really good rushing attack. They got a great defense with the secondary that has a lot of speed, size, and athleticism, and they're really good in special teams. They got a good field goal kicker. They can get hidden yardage when it comes to the return game, punt returns, kickoffs. Remember in that second half against Georgia, they ran it back the first play of the second half. You know, it just felt like Penn State was too good to be true. And, you know, James Franklin now falls to 1-18 all time against top 5 teams. And I had a homie that took Penn State to win this game outright. And I felt bad for him because I was like, my brother, you learned the hard way about betting on little games James Franklin. I was never sold on Penn State when they got into the playoffs. I just looked at their path and I said, you know, they're either going to lose to Georgia or Notre Dame, because there's no chance in hell James Franklin is going to be able to put together a well-coached enough game to be able to take down a coach like Kirby Smart or Marcus Freeman. And although this game was close, you know, look how Notre Dame was able to win. In the before halftime, you got to put your backup in because your starter gets banged up. You have an injured offensive tackle. You got guys dropping left and right. Abdul Carter just destroying everybody, and yet they still find the way to eke out a victory. You know, Notre Dame all season long, they have found ways to win games, and they've come through in the biggest moments. For Penn State, on the other hand, you know, against Ohio State and Oregon, if you can't beat those teams, how are you going to expect to compete with Notre Dame? A lot of you all are going to be really shocked with how close this Notre Dame-Ohio State National Championship is going to be. Notre Dame isn't going to get blown out. They're too well-coached of a team for that to happen. But when Penn State played Ohio State, though, it seemed like they couldn't even buy offense. And the game was a lot more one-sided than what the final score showed. They got a little bit lucky early on during that game with getting that pick six early on Will Howard. You know, just with Penn State moving forward, yeah, they probably are going to be a frequent participant in the expanded playoffs, but they're going to be one of those teams that we talk about them now the same way that we talk about Notre Dame. We're going to be judging them based off history. Every time we see Penn State in the playoffs, we're going to be like, yeah, like they're probably going to get no further than the second round, because if the seeding made a little bit more sense, and let's say that Penn State had to take the same road that Clemson had or Arizona State had, they wouldn't have beaten Texas. I don't even think they would have beaten Georgia. And why do I say that? Because look at James Franklin's track record. He's 1-18 against top 5 teams. History shows us that James Franklin is good to let you down when you go up against a competent opponent. It's one thing to go up against a SMU team that still had a roster that was on the G5 level mostly. And they only got in based off of technicality that they made it to their conference championship game because they were in the weak conference. Yeah, they're a well-coached team, but they also benefited of all of the chaos from the SEC with Alabama and Ole Miss losing. If Bama and Ole Miss never lose, SMU isn't in the playoffs. And the same probably could be said for Indiana. And Boise State, they didn't even really deserve a first-round bye, because I don't think a first-round bye should be awarded to a team that doesn't play in the P4 conference. Because the only reason Boise State's argument was for getting a high seed was because they kept it close and lost by 3 to Oregon. So with the easy path that Penn State had the first 2 rounds, I never was really sold on this team. And you can harp on if Indiana, SMU really deserve to be in, but you got to have that same conversation about Penn State. Because I never once looked at Penn State and felt like they had an opportunity to win it all. You can say they're one of the best 12 teams, but are they really? Would they have beaten Clemson? I felt like Clemson could have beat them. Would they have beaten Georgia? Would they have beaten Oregon if they played again? I really don't know, because let's say Penn State doesn't have that late interception by Drew Aller, and they're able to drive down the field. And let's say they get a touchdown and they win it, right? We're talking about a rematch between Penn State and Ohio State. How do you think that game goes? I think Ohio State drags them. I really do. Because Ohio State is playing better now since that loss to Michigan than what they were the first time they squared off. I felt like it probably would have been like 42-17 with the way that Drew Aller plays in big games. Not only does James Franklin come up small in these big-time matchups, but so does Drew Aller. For some reason, James Franklin just can't seem to get the quarterback position right. He can't seem to get it right on offense. It's like the 3rd straight year in a row that Penn State has been limited with their options at wide receiver. You got great running backs. You always have a fantastic defense. But for some reason, anytime James Franklin gets into these big-time matchups, he just gets small. He just does. And that's why I never really bought the hype with Penn State being able to win it all. And I'm glad that Notre Dame sent them packing, man, because this playoff run for me was a fluke. Oregon should have got the easy path that Penn State did, because Penn State losing the Big Ten championship only benefited them. They were a beneficiary of a flawed playoff seeding system. If these teams were seeded a lot better and accordingly, and, winning your conference championship didn't mean that you would have to play Ohio State off a bye. Penn State, I don't even think they make it out of the first or even the second round. I could have seen Indiana beating Penn State. Who's to say that maybe if Alabama gets in, maybe they could have beaten Penn State. I still would have took Penn State to win that game, but I'm just saying, like, I got some questions about just how good this Penn State team just truly is, because how good are they? Honestly, I'm asking a serious question right now. They lost to the 2 best teams they played this season, and then you lose to Notre Dame in the semifinals. So you were 0-3 against all of the elite teams that you played this year. So what does that show about you? Drew Aller, after his first 2 playoff games, he had a lot of hype about possibly entering the NFL draft and being the first quarterback taken off the board over Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. And I never really understood all of the hype around Drew Aller. You know, yeah, he is a big body kid with a good amount of athleticism. He gives you Josh Allen vibes. But when you watch Drew Aller play, you see the physical traits, you see the athleticism, you see the great arm, but other than that, I mean, in between the head, like when it comes to just getting the ball out fast, being able to make good reads, making good decisions with the football, Drew Aller doesn't really excel in those areas. Against all of the good competition that Penn State has played this year, he's been really underwhelming to watch. Against Illinois, you know, he didn't look that good in that game. Against USC, he threw 3 interceptions in that game. Yeah, he played better in the second half. He led them to a comeback win in overtime. But against Ohio State, he didn't do anything. Against ranked teams this season, Drew Aller had 6 touchdowns to 4 interceptions, and he was completing under 60% of his passes. You know, against Oregon in the Big Ten Championship, he didn't really look that great. You know, he tossed 3 touchdowns, but he also had 2 interceptions in the process. And even with better receivers, I don't know if Drew Aller is going to end up living up to his potential. Maybe it's the James Franklin problem. Maybe James Franklin isn't a good developer of quarterbacks. Maybe he ruins quarterbacks. Because Trace McSorley, I thought, was a pretty good quarterback. At least when it comes to judging a QB on the college standard. And he's been a backup in the NFL. So it's not like the dude can't play at all. But for Drew Aller, for him to have had so much hype and for him to cost Penn State the game the way that he did against Notre Dame, you know, it just has me asking a lot of questions about what do people truly value when it comes to how they assess the quarterback position. Because if Penn State had Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, they easily beat Notre Dame. Shedeur and Cam Ward, not only are they better quarterbacks than Drew Aller on a collegiate level, but they're better NFL prospects because they're more accurate. They're a little bit more polished. They got way more experience. And I think that's kind of what it is for Drew Aller. He still is pretty young into his career. This is only his 2nd season starting. And same thing can be said about Cade Klubnik. But Cade Klubnik, you know, that game that he had against Texas, yeah, they lost that game, but it definitely wasn't because of him, because he was throwing some absolute seeds. I'm talking about that's some of the best football that I've ever seen Cade Klubnik play. But we get into the playoffs, and we look at Drew Aller, you know, against SMU. I cut him a little bit of slack. It was cold, even though he's from that part of the country, but cool. 13 to 22, 59% completion percentage, 129 pass yards, no touchdowns. Against Boise State, that was probably his best outing that he had throughout the entirety of the playoffs. 3 touchdowns, no picks, but he completed only 52% of his passes. And against Notre Dame, which is the best secondary that Penn State has played all year in terms of NFL talent, with the length that they have, the athleticism that they have on the back end, he got exposed. Now, his receivers ain't doing him no favor because Notre Dame's secondary was on them like jam on jelly, white on rice. But at the end of the day, for somebody that gets hyped up to be a potential number 1 overall pick at quarterback, you expect a little bit more aura. You expect a little bit more juice, and I really just didn't see it with Drew Aller. What amazed me more about Drew Aller was how impressive he is running the football. I mean, he's running guys over. He's trucking guys, looking like Mike Oslott at quarterback. I'm more impressed with him as a runner than I am with his ability to throw the football. I mean, he had 1 interception that got called back due to a pass interference penalty, which bailed him out, but I'm asking myself, what was he seeing? What was he seeing throwing that thing up to quadruple coverage to Tyler Warren? I get it. Tyler Warren is a monster. I don't kind of blame him in certain situations, just throwing it up to Tyler Warren. That's it. Nobody's open. Tyler Warren's out there somewhere. Just throw it to him. He'll make a play. But with 3-4 guys around him, did you just get tunnel vision? And I'm not trying to kill Drew Aller, but we got to be critical about him, because the draft community was hyping this dude up like he was going to be the next best thing since Josh Allen, and it's a good thing he is coming back for another season. Yeah, you definitely need another season, my guy. I think in 2025, we could see Drew Aller really step up and reach his potential with some better wide receivers that Penn State is bringing in from out of the portal. But, I mean, his playoff run was nothing impressive to me. I was a little bit shocked when I kept seeing these articles about if Drew Aller continues to play the way that he has in the playoffs, he could end up foregoing his next season and change his mind entering the drive. And I was just asking myself, like, whoever these scouts are, whoever these general managers are that believes this with Drew Aller, they might need to get fired. I hope it wasn't the New York Giants. With everything that's been coming out about Joe Schoen and how he's been handling some of his players and some of his personnel decisions, Drew Aller, if he would have came out this year and the team would have drafted him over Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, they probably would have set themselves back 3-4 years. Because that's how bad Drew Aller looked in these playoffs in terms of him being an NFL prospect. This playoff run, especially with how he looked against Notre Dame, for as much good as it did, this one game by itself tanked his draft stock to the point where even next season, I would even have him as QB3. I like Kay Klubnik more than I like Drew Aller and Arch Manning. So Drew Aller has a lot to prove going into the 2025 season based off how he played in this game against Notre Dame. I mean, the dude could even hit the layups. He could even hit the easy passes when you got a running back flanking out of the backfield. You're missing on those. He's right there. Put it on him. Notre Dame versus Ohio State for all the marbles. We are finally here, people. We are at the finish line. Now, Notre Dame is a 9.5 point, 10-point underdog going into this matchup. And Ohio State does have a more talented team than what Notre Dame has, which is expected because they poured $20 million into this team. They have two of the best players in college football in Caleb Downs and Jeremiah Smith. And it seems like nobody feels like Notre Dame has a chance to win this game. But with the way Michigan beat Ohio State this year, Michigan has given Notre Dame the blueprint for how they can shut down Ohio State. Because what do Michigan and Notre Dame both have in common? Well, Michigan, they had a really good secondary. They were able to shut down the explosive plays that Ohio State has been known to generate via the passing game. Will Howard had his worst performance as a Buckeye, 19 of 33, 175 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 2 picks. Michigan also did a really good job of winning on special teams. Their field goal kicker was like the second most valuable player of the game outside of Mason Graham. And when you look at Notre Dame, they can do similar things that Michigan did when they beat Ohio State. Because Notre Dame has the best secondary in college football. They held Penn State's wide receivers to 0 catches. It doesn't matter how bad of a receiving core you have. When you are a playoff team and you're in arguably the best or second best conference in college football, to hold a program of this caliber to 0 receptions from their receivers is a testament to how good of a secondary you have. A lot of the guys starting in the secondary for Notre Dame are going to be high draft picks when the NFL draft rolls around. And if they're not eligible this year, when they are eligible to declare for the draft, eventually they will be drafted either within the first couple of rounds. Like Xavier Watts, stud. Cornerback Christian Gray, Leonard Moore, studs. So not only do you have a great secondary that has a lot of size, length, and athleticism that matches up well with all of Ohio State's wide receivers, but you're good on special teams. You got a reliable field goal kicker. You know how to find hidden yardage in special teams with the return game, punt returns. Of course, remember the kickoff that they had to start off the second half against Georgia. And Notre Dame is built off physicality, just like how Michigan is built off physicality. And Michigan, their quarterback didn't really give them a good display of passing, but they won that game due to their ability to run the football. Well, with Jeremiah Love and Riley Leonard, You should be able to do that. If Michigan can have success offensively, running the ball on Ohio State, being able to somewhat get in scoring range to make some field goals, so can Notre Dame. Notre Dame, like Michigan, is built to win ugly games. And I don't think that we've seen Ohio State win an ugly game this year. Against Texas, to me, I don't consider that to be an ugly game because let's not act like Ohio State wasn't in control during that game. Not at one point did it actually feel like the momentum swung in Texas' favor. I mean, even when Texas was able to tie it up before halftime, it's 7-7 with a few seconds left. They get a screen pass to Travion Henderson, and he's housing that thing for a touchdown. It's 14-7. This seemed like anytime Texas got back into the game, Ohio State regained control of it. For Notre Dame, they are better equipped to handle the personnel that Ohio State has than what Texas is, just because they just have a better secondary across the board than what the Longhorns do. Now, up front is probably where the concern lies. But the problem with Notre Dame up front is that you wonder about their size. But at the same time, let's not act like Ohio State isn't dealing with a lot of injuries on the offensive line. They're down 2 starters on that side. So I feel like that kind of evens out. And on the offensive line, Notre Dame has all their backup came in and he was playing really well against a Penn State defensive front. To who they are, no matter the odds. With how the first half went against Penn State, you thought the game was over. But in the second half, Notre Dame made some adjustments and they took control of the ball game and they eventually won it. And that's the difference between Notre Dame and all of the other teams that we've seen Ohio State roll over during this playoff run. You know, Tennessee, they didn't have no curveball. Same thing with Oregon. Oregon was kind of shell-shocked. You can make the argument that Marcus Freeman, with him being able to outcoach Kirby Smart, he could definitely do the same to Ryan Day. You know, I'm not about to come out here and say that it's a full guarantee that Ohio State is going to win this game. Notre Dame is not that TCU team that we saw Georgia obliterate on national television. This is a really good team that earned their right here. They beat Penn State, they beat Georgia, they beat Indiana, they beat 3 straight of the best teams in the playoffs outside of Indiana. You know, Penn State's pretty good. Same thing with Georgia. Beating Georgia is beating Georgia, no matter if you beat them during a down year or during a good year. If you're able to beat Kirby Smart, you're stamped as a good head coach. You know, Marcus Freeman, he needs to go back, look at that film for how Michigan played Ohio State, and he needs to implement that into this game plan because although Ohio State is a way different team, a way better team than what they are now, they still have personnel that matches up well to give Ohio State fits. So that's why I feel like Michigan, with their win over Ohio State, has given Notre Dame the perfect game plan to being able to pull off this upset. Now, y'all let me know if I'm reaching, but I really feel like the Fighting Irish can hang around this game. I think right now the line is at 9.5, 10. It's probably going to move around. I don't see it really dropping down to 8 or 7, but I love Notre Dame at 9.5, 10 points because this is a team that they're built to win the dogfight. They want to get in the street fight with you, and I think that's what this game is going to become. The last thing I want to talk about before I get up on out of here. So Miami has finally gotten the replacement for Cam Ward, the greatest quarterback in Miami Hurricanes history. And they're bringing in former Georgia quarterback Carson Beck. Now, here's my problem with this acquisition. It's not more so that I think Carson Beck is bad. I think Carson Beck is a really solid quarterback, especially considering how dire of a situation the Hurricanes were in when it came to their quarterback room after Cam Ward. We didn't see him play in the second half of the Pop-Tart Bowl when Emory Williams came in. the game was unwatchable, especially when it came to Miami's offense. He couldn't complete a pass to save his life. You bring in Carson Beck coming off a season where he tossed 28 touchdown passes but had 12 interceptions, and you had a wide receiving core that had hella drops. Coming to Miami with a better supporting cast, a great offensive line, a good stable of running backs, and Shannon Dawson as his offensive coordinator, you expect him to be pretty productive. But getting Carson Beck isn't going to make Miami a favorite to win the ACC championship, nor is it going to make them a playoff participant next season. I think at best, getting Carson Beck makes Miami a 9-win team at best. And it's not because of Carson Beck not being good, but it's because Miami fans are gassing up how big of an impact Carson Beck is going to have on next year's Miami team because of Mario Cristobal. Mario Cristobal is not a good head coach. He's mediocre. He's a great recruiter. He's really good at being able to acquire talent, but he does a poor job of being able to coach that talent to its full potential. And with Carson Beck not being nowhere near the talent that's what Cam Ward is, he's not going to be able to elevate Mario Cristobal's poor coaching. Cam Ward, all this past season, carried this team on his back, including Mario Cristobal. He got Mario Cristobal out of some really bad situations, but eventually it came back to show just how competent Mario Cristobal is with how Miami lost against Syracuse, deciding to play it safe, kick the field goal instead of going for it, although your defense played like trash. What about when Miami had to come back from behind against Cal or Virginia Tech? That was because you had such a transcendent quarterback in Cam Ward that you were able to overcome poor coaching. Carson Beck isn't that kind of quarterback. You look at the 25-3 record, but I would attribute that record to how good of a coach Kirby Smart is, because before Carson Beck took over as the starter in Georgia, do you remember who their starting quarterback was that led them to back-to-back national championships? It wasn't a 5 or 4-star guy out of high school. It was a walk-on named Sir Stetson Bennett. If Georgia can win back-to-back national championships with Stetson Bennett, who are you giving most of that credit to? Kirby Smart or Carson Beck for going 25-3? I think we all know what the answer is. Carson Beck is a solid quarterback, but he's not good enough to the level Cam Ward was to be able to overcome Mario Cristobal's lack of good coaching. Yeah, Miami may now become a hotbed for quarterback transfers, but just because you're able to lure in good quarterbacks doesn't mean that they're going to be able to elevate your team to a playoff level or a high enough level to win the conference title when you have such an incompetent head coach that is Mario Cristobal. I don't know why you Miami fans can't see the silver lining with Mario. He's just not a good coach. This dude wasted the greatest quarterback to ever put on the Miami Hurricanes jersey. Cam Ward is a generational quarterback. Guys like Cam Ward don't grow on trees. You don't find somebody who was a 0-star coming out of high school, was FCS Player of the Year for Incarnate Ward, goes to Washington State, balls out at a bigger school against difficult competition, playing in the ACC on Miami. You just don't find that. You just don't. And I don't believe that Carson Beck is going to play good enough to be able to overcome the bad clock management, the bad situational football that we constantly see from Mario Cristobal. Rhett Lashlee, in only 3 seasons at SMU, has led them to their American Conference Championship and the ACC title game and the appearance in the college football playoffs. And yet, we got to keep waiting, 4 or 5 years for Mario Cristobal to do it at a school that has more resources than what SMU has. Rhett Lashlee is doing more with less, and Mario Cristobal is doing less with more. Imagine if Rhett Lashlee had Cam Ward. He probably would have ended up upsetting Penn State in the first round. You know, like Rhett Lashlee was the only coach that had Tyler Van Dyke playing good football. He was the only bright spot of Manny Diaz's tenure at Miami. There's a reason why all these former Hurricanes players keep flocking to him, and he keeps elevating them, getting the most out of them because he's a great coach. Mario Cristobal is not. You know, you can say what you want to say about SMU not really playing anybody, but it's like SMU beat the teams they were supposed to beat. Meanwhile, Miami's losing to Syracuse. They're losing to Georgia Tech. So, yeah, like, SMU didn't play a great schedule, but neither did Miami. Did Miami even beat a single-ranked team this year? No, they didn't. So, it's like, if you're going to discredit SMU for not beating anybody good, then you have to discredit Miami and Mario Cristobal for losing the teams that were nowhere as good as what they were from a talent standpoint. That's why I don't see that Carson Beck is going to be good enough to elevate Miami to an ACC championship or to an appearance in the college football playoffs, because he has to overcome the lackluster coaching that he's going to receive from Mario Cristobal. Y'all make it seem like Mario Cristobal is the one calling the plays. He don't call the plays on the offense. Shannon Dawson does. Miami fans are gassing up Carson Beck. And I hate coming on here sounding like I'm a negative Nancy all the time when I talk about my favorite team. But being a fan of 14 years with this program, it's the same old with these coaches. It's rinse, wash, and repeat. You have a season when you kind of peak, you win like 9-10 games, and right after that, you crash right back down to earth. We've seen it with Al Golden. We've seen it with Mark Richt. We didn't really see it with Manny Diaz, but we're going to see the same thing transpire with Mario Cristobal. I just don't believe in him. When you have to hire somebody to help you manage late-game situations and you're still struggling in late-game situations, it's an indictment on you as a coach. Like, remember, it came out that Mario Cristobal hired an assistant to help him better manage the clock, better manage late-game situations. And it didn't look like that hire really had any difference. If anything, that dude deserves to get fired because Miami still lost games due to bad clock management and poor understanding of situational football. Unless Carson Beck becomes better than what Cam Ward was or just as good, he's not going to be able to elevate Miami anywhere past the level that they were this past season with Cam Ward. This is it for this episode of the JT Sports Podcast. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Shout out to Valerie 1111. Greatly appreciate you. She says, as a longtime Canes fan, I concur with you on this. Yikes. Greatly appreciate it. Shout out to M Spark, says, not sold on Drew Aller neither. Average NFL quarterback, absolutely. Shout out to my guy, Eddie Peludo. He says, what's up, bro? What's going on, my dude? He says, even though the Texans have looked like pretenders, I'm still excited. My team is in the dance. Can't wait. Absolutely, man. I'm about to get up off here to watch these wild card matchups. Make sure y'all like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Make sure that you follow us wherever you get your podcast from. Apple, Spotify, Amazon. The JT Sports Podcast is available. The links are down in the description down below. And I'll see you guys